Generally, the narrative surrounding the defeat of Napoleon goes something like this. Napoleon blundered by invading Spain, leading to a gradual bleeding of France's resources for years. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with 500,000 men and was defeated, losing nearly his entire army that followed him into Russia. In an attempt to save his empire, Napoleon rebuilds his army for the Battle of Leipzig, only to be defeated once more. The rest of the War of the Sixth Coalition sees Napoleon conducting a desperate defensive campaign all the way to Paris, where he is finally compelled to surrender by his marshals. 1815 sees Napoleon make one last desperate gamble, reclaiming France only to be defeated by the British at Waterloo. Besides largely oversimplifying the military campaigns, this narrative completely ignores the often frantic diplomacy taking place in the background. On the coalition's part, its creation was not planned in advance and was the reaction to events as they developed. Each new power that joined had its own goals, beyond just defeating their common enemy in Napoleon. Coordinating such a coalition therefore proved to be no easy task, with repeated talks on just what exactly the coalition's aims would be. For France and Napoleon, the disunited nature of the coalition provided no less than 3 opportunities to completely change his fortunes and peace out of the war. The first came in April 1813, as Austria now found itself as the kingmaker of the War of the Sixth Coalition. Neither side would prove able to conclusively defeat the other, so whichever side Austria joined would likely win. Before joining the conflict, however, Austria attempted to mediate their own peace to try and undercut Russia and Prussian gains, while keeping France as a counterbalance. In June, Napoleon was approached by Austria's Metternich, who offered to mediate an end to the conflict in return for a number of significant concessions. Austria's demands include the return of Illyria, the partition of the Duchy of Warsaw, and the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon accepted Austrian mediation as a way to buy time for him to strengthen his own forces. Negotiations began in earnest with the opening of the Congress of Prague, where further demands included for Napoleon to give up Germany, Holland, Spain, and Italy. Negotiations swiftly broke down, and on August 10th, Austria sided with the coalition. A second opportunity came after the defeat at Leipzig with the Frankfurt Proposals. In November, the proposals were crafted by Metternich and presented to Napoleon. They would allow Napoleon to remain emperor and France to keep its natural borders as defined by the Revolution, up to the Rhine River, Pyrenees, and Alps. Everything else, all possessions in Poland, Germany, Spain, and Italy, had to be given up. Again, Napoleon delayed, and the offer was withdrawn at the insistence of the British in December. With the invasion of France itself imminent, Napoleon would attempt to reopen negotiations based on the Frankfurt Proposals, but by this time the old offer was no longer on the table. Now the coalition demanded that Napoleon give up all of France's post-1791 gains. Finding these terms unacceptable, Napoleon once more refused to surrender, conducting a defensive campaign into the heart of France. The result was his complete defeat and banishment to the island of Elba. What if Napoleon had accepted one of the peace offers given to him? How might history have gone differently? As long as Napoleon had a chance to win the war on the battlefield, he would be very unlikely to give up, so the Austrian offer of mediation would still fail in our timeline. Instead, defeat at Leipzig would prove to be enough to make the emperor see reason. Napoleon would accept the Frankfurt Proposals, remaining emperor and keeping French conquests up to their natural borders. The British representative, Lord Aberdeen, had accepted the terms of the Frankfurt Proposals without fully understanding the government's stance back in London. Even so, with the rest of the coalition backing the deal, British attempts at backtracking would fail. After 2 decades of war, Europe would once more find peace, only for the threat of war to emerge once more soon after. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious powers would sit down to redraw the map of Europe, and by necessity France would be included. Not with much enthusiasm, mind you, and likely after much debate, but with the goal of the Congress being the creation of a lasting peace. France was just too important of a country to ignore, especially with Metternich wishing for France to remain a counterbalance to Russia. Under the leadership of the skilled French diplomat Talleyrand, France would not overplay its hand at the Congress to avoid the other powers uniting against France. Russia and Prussia especially would oppose any proposal set forward by the French, but Talleyrand would find room to maneuver by backing the proposals of some of the other powers. The result would be minor French victories in 2 areas. Historically, war nearly broke out over the question of Poland and Saxony. with Prussia and Russia on one side, and the British, Austrians, and French on the other. In this timeline, the same issue would again nearly lead to war, but with the added threat of Napoleon leading French forces, no one would want that, and so the powers would be forced to compromise, with France backing the more aggressive proposals that called for an independent Poland. In ironic twist, both France and Britain would find themselves on the same side after Talleyrand promised that the French fleet would be reduced to pre-revolution levels. The final agreement would see Prussia receive territorial concessions along the Rhine, part of the Polish territory, and bits of Saxony. Russia, too, would receive a large chunk of Polish territory, including parts from what Austria once controlled. What remained would form a new, much-reduced Polish state, importantly, free and independent. Poland would naturally find itself allied closely with France. Italy, too, would see deviations from the historical timeline, with Murat still on the throne in Naples at the time of the Congress. Murat's betrayal of Napoleon after Leipzig and the general distrust most European powers held towards Murat would lead him to being deposed by the Congress. Austria would maintain its historical influence in Italy, with only the King of Sardinia being in the French sphere of influence. Now to address the Corsican-shaped elephant in the room. What would Napoleon do after his defeat? The obvious answer that should come as no surprise is that he would consolidate his position in France, rebuild his army, and likely wait for an opportunity to break out of the metaphorical box the powers of Europe had placed him in. The peace would hold, however, as the rest of Europe would make clear that any aggression by France would be met by the combined opposition of all the other powers. It is perhaps fortunate, then, that Napoleon was unknowingly in a race against the clock. Historically, Napoleon died in 1821, and despite having the backing of the best imperial doctors in our timeline, he would not survive past 1825, leaving his son, Napoleon II, to become emperor at the age of 14. Uneasy though the peace may be, I believe it would last a decade, with France being left in a strong position. Likely with at least okay relations with Austria, as they would be the most willing to work with Imperial France. Britain, meanwhile, would have redoubled its colonial efforts, seizing the majority of Dutch colonies, specifically the Dutch East Indies. A careful eye would be put on France, and its fleet always ready should war break out once more. Napoleon's death would signal the end of an era, and the start of a new one that the monarchies of Europe hoped would be less disruptive. Spain's colonial empire would collapse after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and there's no changing that. Events in Spain itself, however, would progress somewhat differently. In 1820, a military uprising forced King Ferdinand VII to accept the 1812 liberal constitution that had originally been made during the Peninsular War. The constitution was one of, if not the most liberal constitutions in Europe at the time, which turned the absolute monarchy of Ferdinand into a constitutional monarchy. Historically, the powers of Europe agreed to allow Bourbon France to intervene in Spain to restore Ferdinand's absolute rule in 1823. Nearly 100,000 French soldiers would be sent to restore absolutist rule in Spain. In our timeline, this would never occur. A liberal Spain would still be seen as a threat by the monarchies of Europe, but French intervention would be out of the question. Memories of the Peninsular War far too recent. What's more, Imperial France would be more likely to support the Spanish liberals as a way to break its strategic encirclement. If Napoleonic France supported the liberals, especially in the face of outside intervention, then a strong alliance with Spain could be formed, especially considering that a large portion of the liberals' backing came from the Spanish military. The end result, outside intervention by one or more absolute monarchies aside, would be a heavily liberal, if unstable, Spain, allied to France. Instability would spread throughout Europe in successive waves as new liberal ideas and nationalism began to clash with the monarchies of old. It would start more slowly in our timeline with the lack of another revolution to set events off in Europe coming from France. Instead, minor revolts would occur only to be suppressed in Belgium, French Rhineland, in Italy, Polish, Prussia, and Russia. All of these movements would be crushed by military might, with the Italian movement seeing the most success, before being forced to dissolve under Austrian intervention. A greater series of revolutions would eventually take place at some point, mirroring the historical revolutions in 1848 in many ways. France would likely see some form of disruption by those who supported republican ideas, but the Napoleonic shadow would still loom large in most people's minds. Barring some disastrous action to lose the goodwill of the people, the Napoleonic government would survive without too much trouble. Much more trouble would come from the bleed over of the French revolutions that would spread to the French Rhineland, with the German population likely rising in open revolt. The French army would be sent in to crush the revolts, but the entire affair would leave a lasting impression on both the people and the government's views towards German nationalism. Austria would still get the worst of the revolutions by far, nearly collapsing if not for the Russian intervention to defeat the Hungarian army. Italy, however, would slip further from Austria's grasp as French backing of the Kingdom of Sardinia allowed them to make gains. After several battles, Italian forces would secure Lombardy from Austria, but be unable to advance any further in Austrian-held Italy. Under French pressure, the war would end with the Kingdom of Sardinia annexing Lombardy, but seeing its further territorial ambitions unachieved. Around the Polish state, Polish uprisings would occur in Prussia, Russia, and Austria. All would eventually be defeated, but the uprisings would convince the three powers that a Polish state would be too dangerous an entity to be allowed to exist. The Polish territory would subsequently be invaded and annexed by Russia, with Austria agreeing to the Russian move in return for their assistance against Hungary, and Prussia more concerned with the events in Germany. The unification of Germany and Italy in some form would be inevitable. Both would be tied together in the form of Austria, with France backing the formation of a united Italy, but not that of a united Germany, due to the large German population within its borders. Out of the two, Italy would be able to form earlier than historical, due to more consistent French support, with all of Italy besides the last Austrian possessions unifying under the Kingdom of Sardinia. Imperial France would not ally itself as closely with the papacy, preventing the incorporation of Rome into Italy, therefore also not straining Italian-French relations. Prussia would be forced to take a more cautious approach to forming a unified Germany with the threat of Imperial France on its border. Bismarck's cunning would still lead to a war between Austria and Prussia at some point, with Italy joining Prussia to finally finish the unification of Italy, therefore also keeping France out of the conflict. By the time France fully realized the extent that Bismarck had managed to unify the German states into the North German Confederation, it would be too late, and the war would be over, taking the chance to intervene with it. At this point, Austria, Italy, and France would ally against the new confederation under Prussia. Historically, this was attempted, but the strained Franco-Italian relations and speed of collapse of the Second Empire prevented any serious support from materializing. Here the alliance would be much stronger, with the French military better prepared for a conflict with the Prussian war machine. Bismarck would be aware of this too, but with the large German population in the French Rhineland and the need to further unify the German states into a single entity, war would come eventually. I have no doubt Bismarck would find some way to stack the deck in his favor, but at this point the timeline's grown divergent enough to make it rather difficult to guess how the war would turn out. Perhaps the Prussian juggernaut could still steamroll the French army. Maybe Bismarck is able to convince Russia to join the war on his side. On the other hand, Bismarck might never get his chance to start a war with France in favorable terms at all. The invasion of France might be defeated or even just stalled, allowing Italy and Austria to strike at Germany. Dreams of a united Germany may well be set back decades, or never be fully realized as multiple German states are forced to coexist. Whatever the result, future wars would certainly follow in the wake of such a conflict, either in an effort to fulfill the dreams of a united Germany, or to challenge the industrial and military might of the German Empire. Peace would not last, but I feel here's a good spot to end this what if, as from here anything could happen.